The first thing you should know about Harold Bennett is that he wasn't reckless. He was 72, a retired school teacher. The kind of man who made his bed every morning, folded his shirts neatly, and double-knotted his laces before heading out the door. For neighbors in Stowe, Vermont, Harold was steady as the seasons. Every afternoon when the sun tilted low over the maple ridges, you could count on seeing him step onto the trail that wound behind his farmhouse. The walk was his ritual. 15 years after his wife passed, it had become both his exercise and his prayer. He didn't push himself to conquer peaks. He simply walked. He liked the sound of chickadees flicking through birch branches, the smell of pine resin sticking to his coat, and the rhythm of boots crunching over the leaves. The woods were in a way his companion. That late October afternoon looked like any other. Golden light spilled across the valley, the air crisp enough to bite, but not yet winter harsh. Harold slipped on his flannel, tucked a thermos of tea in his jacket pocket, and carried the same old walking stick he'd carved back when Claire, his daughter, was just a child. She used to run her fingers along the grooves, asking if the lines told a story. He'd tap the stick on the porch rail and say, "Every trail we walk, every lesson we learn, leaves a mark. Someday you'll see the story yourself." It was one of those small rituals that seemed like nothing at the time, but lingered for decades. When Claire stopped by that evening and saw the stick still propped against the porch, her chest tightened. The house was empty. His boots were gone. The kettle on the stove was cool. He'd left hours earlier and hadn't returned. She dialed his number and the call went to voicemail. The light drained out of the valley's shadows, swallowing the ridges, and the kind of silence that belongs only to remote woods settled in. That was when worry began to climb her ribs like cold fingers. By nightfall, Sheriff Michael Carter had arrived with 2 deputies. They swept Harold's usual loop 3 miles down the valley trail and back. Nothing. No boot prints, no broken branches, no sign of him stopping for rest. It was as if the woods had simply closed around him. Volunteers from town trickled in the next morning, some bringing thermoses, some bringing dogs, some bringing little more than hope. They knew Harold. He'd taught their kids multiplication tables, coached pee-wee baseball, and handed out extra mittens to students who'd come to school unprepared. You don't forget a man like that, and you don't leave him to the cold. The search began methodically. They walked the creek beds, checked old hunting shacks, and fanned out in grids across Sterling Forest. But there was no sign. An elderly man missing in the woods isn't unusual in Vermont. Local rangers could list dozens of cases, most ending with a hiker found cold, disoriented, and embarrassed. But Harold's case felt different. The absence of clues was unnerving. Every time the volunteers circled back to the command post, they shook their heads. No tracks, no jacket caught on a branch, no thermos, nothing. It was as if the trail itself had swallowed him. When someone goes missing outdoors, our first instinct is to search the obvious places. The trailhead, the marked path, the cabin nearby. But people, especially the elderly, often wander farther than expected. Studies show that those with mild memory lapses or even deep concentration in nature can stray miles off course. One famous case in New Hampshire involved a 90-year-old woman who walked nearly 6 miles from her starting point before she was found. Searchers often underestimate how far determination or disorientation can carry someone. In Harold's case, that mistake nearly cost him his life. Claire refused to rest. She stayed at the search post through the first cold night, clutching that carved walking stick, tracing its grooves like a rosary. She remembered their shared rituals, her father pouring 2 mugs of cocoa after sledding his way of humming old jazz records, while fixing the porch railing, the bedtime promise he always made. "I'll always bring you back home, safe." It haunted her now because this time he hadn't returned, and she wasn't sure she could bring him back herself. By the second day, tension crackled. Sheriff Carter called in state troopers, even a helicopter sweep. Still nothing. Volunteers grew weary. Some muttered that maybe Harold had slipped into the river and been carried downstream. Others said maybe he'd chosen to vanish grief after years alone, finally catching him. Claire snapped at that. "My father doesn't give up," she said. "If he's out there, he's waiting. And he's expecting me to find him." Her voice carried not just stubbornness, but a daughter's conviction born from decades of trust. If you've ever had a loved one go missing even for a moment, you know how quickly the mind flips between hope and dread. The phone call went unanswered. The empty driveway at midnight. The silence that presses in. In that space, logic falters and instinct takes over. That's where Claire was, logic exhausted, instinct sharp as a blade. She couldn't explain it, but she felt her father was alive. Tired, cold, but alive. And she was unwilling to surrender to the statistics. We often think of rescue as a job for professionals, sheriffs, EMTs, trained search and rescue teams, and they are essential. But history shows that ordinary people driven by love or intuition sometimes notice what official teams overlook. A neighbor hears a faint call in the night. A hunter sees a glint of cloth on a branch. Or, as this story will reveal, sometimes an animal untamed and unexpected becomes the guide. Rescue is rarely neat. It's messy, layered, and often born from unlikely alliances. As dusk fell on the third day, Claire stood near the search line, boots, muddy eyes hollow from lack of sleep. The volunteers were debating whether to suspend until morning. Even Sheriff Carter rubbed his temples, the weight of failure heavy in his jaw. That's when a photographer named Rachel Hayes, who'd been documenting autumn wildlife in the area, approached. She mentioned seeing something unusual, a black bear cub, lingering near the edge of the Hollow Mile, the abandoned logging grounds. Normally, cubs dart away at the first sign of humans. This one had lingered circling, almost beckoning. She said it twice just to make sure people didn't dismiss her. It wasn't running, it was waiting. Most scoffed, a bear cub leading to a missing man. Unthinkable. But Claire, exhausted and desperate, didn't laugh. She straightened, clutched the walking stick tighter, and whispered, "Then that's where I'm going." And with that, the story shifted. A search that had seemed doomed, circling the same dead ends, now had a new, improbable lead. The forest still held its secrets, but something was stirring at the edge of Sterling Forest. Something small, black-furred, and determined to be seen. The kind of presence no one expects, but no one can ignore. The cub wasn't just a passing shadow. In the days to come, it would prove to be the key to unraveling a mystery that human eyes had missed. The next chapter begins where the trail turns wild and a black bear cub steps into the role of unlikely guide. Rachel Hayes had been out in the woods that morning with her camera slung over her shoulder. She wasn't searching for Harold. She wasn't part of the sheriff's team or the volunteers. She was there because autumn was her favorite season for wildlife photography. Maple leaves turning orange, flocks of geese lifting off deer moving quietly across the ridgelines. She had learned that if you were patient and still, the forest gave you gifts, a fox trotting across a clearing, a hawk circling overhead, a black bear cub tumbling after its mother. But what she saw that morning was different. She'd set up near the edge of Sterling Forest in a thicket that overlooked an old logging road. The air was brittle with frost, her fingers stiff around the lens. Then the movement caught her eye. A black bear cub, small, scraggly, no more than 6 months old, stood on the road staring straight at her. Normally, cubs this age dart the moment they smell humans, but this one didn't. It pawed the dirt. It circled twice. It let out a high-pitched call that wasn't quite a cry, not quite a growl, something in between. Then it walked a few yards down the road, stopped and looked back. Rachel lowered her camera. She'd spent enough time in the woods to know this wasn't ordinary. The cub wasn't just passing through, it seemed to want her attention. Still, her first instinct was caution. Where there's a cub, there's usually a mother. A black bear sow is nothing to test. But Rachel scanned the tree line, waited, and saw nothing. No heavy shape moving through the brush. No warning huff, just the cub persistent and oddly deliberate. She raised her camera again, snapped a few frames, but her heart wasn't in it. She was thinking about Harold. Everyone in Stowe knew he was missing. His face was taped to cafe windows, his name carried on hushed lips in the grocery store. Rachel had followed the updates, but kept her distance, photographers often do, fearing they'll intrude. Yet now, with the cub staring at her, she wondered if distance was the wrong choice. The animal took a few more steps, stopped, and looked back again. Rachel whispered under her breath, "What are you doing?" She could almost believe it was guiding her. There's an important point here. We often imagine wild animals as completely detached from us, just instincts, no intention. But research shows their behavior can be far more complex. Bears especially. Black bears are curious, observant, and highly adaptable around humans. A study in Minnesota found that bears would sometimes shadow search parties after forest fires, drawn not by food, but by the activity and urgency of people moving together. The lesson is this: never underestimate an animal's awareness. It may not think in words, but it notices, interprets, and sometimes reacts in ways that blur the line between instinct and choice. Rachel hesitated. Following a bear cub wasn't something any wildlife guide would recommend. But then she remembered something from her childhood. Her grandfather had once told her about a lost hunter found because a stray dog barked at the right spot. "Sometimes the woods send you help," he'd said, "not always in the form you expect." She tucked her camera under her arm, kept her distance, and began to walk. The cub led her about a quarter of a mile into the forest, stopping off and circling back if she lagged. At one point it pawed the ground near a fallen birch, almost impatient. Rachel's pulse quickened. It was strange, yes, but not impossible. Animals have played roles in rescues before. There's the story of dolphins circling a lost diver until the Coast Guard noticed, or the tale of a horse that refused to leave a pasture, drawing attention to a boy trapped in a nearby well. These stories remind us that animals sometimes perceive distress in ways we cannot, and sometimes they act. By the time Rachel reached the ridgeline, she could hear the faint voices of the volunteer search party on the far side of the valley. They were shouting Harold's name, their calls echoing back unanswered. The cub didn't move toward them. Instead, it pressed deeper into the brush, heading straight toward the edge of the hollow mile, the abandoned logging grounds no one liked to enter. Rachel froze. That place was dangerous: rotted cabins, rusting saw blades, pits where the earth had caved in. Search teams avoided it unless necessary. Yet here the cub was pressing in. Rachel debated turning back. She wasn't trained for rescue, but she also knew what giving up looked like, people shaking their heads, saying too late, when in fact it might not be. She decided that if the cub wanted her to see something, she'd follow at least a little further. She moved carefully, snapping twigs underfoot, the cub trotting just ahead. Then she stopped. Her rational mind screamed, "It's just an animal. You're reading into it." But her gut whispered, "Don't ignore this. Not now." And here lies another lesson. In emergencies, intuition isn't always opposed to logic. Sometimes it's what bridges the gap when logic runs out. We've all experienced it, that quiet nudge to check on a loved one, to take a different road, to knock on a neighbor's door. Most times it leads nowhere special, but sometimes it makes the difference between loss and rescue. Rachel understood this. She didn't trust the cub blindly, but she also didn't dismiss what felt undeniable. As she emerged from the underbrush onto the logging road, she saw the sheriff's deputies regrouping with volunteers. She raised her arm and called out, "There's a cub here leading into the hollow." Mile heads turned. Some laughed, some shook their heads. One deputy muttered, "We're not following a bear." But Claire Bennett, pale and exhausted, stepped forward. "Where?" she demanded. Rachel pointed. "Right there. It's waiting." The cub was at the tree line, pawing the ground, its small body almost vibrating with insistence. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed the carved walking stick from her pack and started forward. "If there's even a chance," she said, "we follow." Her voice was raw, but steady, and in that moment, the group faced a choice: dismiss the strange or embrace it. Communities sometimes stall in crisis because they stick too rigidly to the expected. We want straight lines, clear clues, proven strategies. But nature doesn't always play by our rules. Sometimes the answer is hidden in an unlikely source. This is what makes wildlife rescue stories so powerful. They remind us that solutions can come from places we're least willing to look. Sheriff Carter rubbed his jaw, torn between caution and compassion. He finally nodded. "We'll send a small team in with you, but if we don't see anything, we turn back." Claire locked eyes with him. We won't need to turn back. So the line of people moved Rachel Clare, 2 deputies following a black bear cub into a place locals had avoided for years. Behind them, the rest of the volunteers watched in silence, half skeptical, half spellbound. And for the first time in days, Claire's steps weren't dragging with despair. They carried something else, fragile hope. The cub wasn't leading them into safety, it was guiding them straight into the Hollow Mile, a place full of shadows and old secrets. The question was, what waited at the end of that trail? The locals called it the Hollow Mile, a stretch of sterling forest where the old logging camp had once thrived and then collapsed into ruin. Piles of timber rotted into the soil cabins sagged under snow loads, and machinery rusted in silence. For years, hunters and hikers gave it a wide berth. Not because of ghosts, though stories floated around campfires, but because the land itself seemed unfriendly. Sinkholes, jagged scrap metal wells without warning. Even maps warned unstable terrain, use caution. That was exactly where the black bear cub was heading. Rachel Hayes adjusted her camera strap nervously as she stepped in behind Claire Bennett. Sheriff Carter flanked them, deputies trailing with flashlights. The cub trotted a few yards ahead, pausing often, looking back with small snorts as if to say, "Keep moving." Each time, Claire gripped her father's walking stick tighter. Exhaustion showed in her body, but her will pushed her forward. The volunteers left behind muttered that it was foolish. But for Claire, the foolish part would have been doing nothing. Walking into the Hollow Mile wasn't easy. Fallen beams forced them to climb briars, caught on jackets, and icy puddles broke underfoot. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Birds fell silent. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Carter finally broke the hush. "We've searched here before. Found nothing." Rachel shook her head. "Not here," she said softly. "Not with this guide." She nodded toward the cub. Rescue teams often stick to grid patterns and familiar routes. It's efficient but flawed. Studies of lost person behavior show that missing hikers, especially older adults, don't follow predictable lines. They follow instinct toward water downhill, sometimes even in circles. That's why searchers often miss the critical zone until something or someone forces them deeper. An example comes from Colorado, where an elderly man vanished near Pike National Forest. Crews combed the area for days, certain he would stay near the trail. When they finally found him alive, he'd wandered far off, drawn by the sound of a creek he thought led back to camp. The lesson is simple. Rescue requires flexibility. Sticking only to logic blinds us to where desperation might really lead. The cub pressed onward. At one point, it clawed at the dirt beside a collapsed cabin nose, working furiously. Carter frowned. Could be nothing, he said. But Claire crouched, brushing leaves aside. She found a scrap of fabric, gray and worn. Her breath caught. "That's from Dad's jacket." The deputies exchanged glances. Doubt cracked. Rachel lifted her camera, but didn't shoot. Some moments weren't meant for lenses. They were meant for memory. She watched as Claire clutched the fabric to her chest, whispering, "He came through here." It was proof small but undeniable. Sometimes we need a shift in belief before we can act with courage. The deputies, once skeptical, now moved with urgency. One muttered, "Maybe this little bear knows more than we do." It wasn't science, but it was hope. And in rescue work, hope keeps the boots moving when logic says, "Stop." They followed the cub deeper past the cabin ruins and into the true heart of the Hollow Mile. The ground dipped sharply, littered with broken planks. Carter raised a hand. "Careful here." Old Wells, his warning proved timely. Seconds later, one deputy's boot sank into soft earth. They hauled him back, quickly shaken. Claire stared at the hole yawning beneath, imagining her father somewhere in the dark, trapped. The urgency in her face silenced everyone. There's a lesson here for us, too. We tend to avoid difficult ground, whether in forests or in life. It feels safer to stay on the trail, to keep to the known. But sometimes what we most need lies in the very place we fear to step. Sterling Forest was unforgiving, yes, but it also held the only path to Harold. As they pushed farther, the cub stopped again, pawing at a ridge of earth near a rusted saw blade. It sat back on its haunches, staring at them, then gave a short huff. Rachel's voice trembled. "It wants us to see something." Carter knelt, brushed leaves aside, and found a fresh scuff-marked boot tread pressed deep. Not volunteer boots, older worn soles. Harold's. The deputies erupted in disbelief. Carter's jaw set. "All right," he said, "we keep going." For Claire, the scuff mark was like a pulse. Proof that her father was alive, still moving, still fighting. She remembered him teaching her to ride a bike on a gravel road, steadying the seat, telling her, "When you wobble, don't freeze. Keep pedaling." That advice hummed in her blood now. She was wobbling, terrified, but she kept walking. Rachel lagged briefly, framing the scene in her mind. She wasn't thinking of headlines or galleries. She was thinking of the strange bond forming between human and animal, volunteer and cub, grief and persistence. She whispered to herself, "Sometimes the forest sends you help." And for the first time, she believed it wasn't just a family saying. By late afternoon, the light was draining fast. The team paused at a clearing where the cub paced in circles. Claire dropped to her knees, clutching the walking stick. "Dad," she called into the trees, voice cracking. "If you can hear me, hold on." Her plea hung in the air, unanswered but not lost. Carter touched her shoulder. "We're close. I can feel it." His words surprised even him. He'd spent years training himself to avoid sentiment, but something about that cub, that scrap of fabric, that boot tread, it all pierced the armor of procedure. Maybe rescue wasn't just about maps and grids. Maybe it was about listening to people, to instincts, to the wild itself. Animals don't always act as saviors. We can't romanticize every encounter, but in rare moments their behavior intersects with our needs, and the result can be extraordinary. Recognizing those moments requires humility. The humility to admit that humans don't always see best. The cub finally stopped near the base of a ridge, sniffing at a sinkhole half hidden by brush. It pawed at the ground, whined softly, and then sat. Everyone fell silent. Carter motioned for the deputies to check the edge. One leaned forward, shone his flashlight, and froze. "There's something down there," he whispered. Claire rushed forward, her heart hammering. For the first time in 3 days, there was a trail leading straight to Harold. The hollow mile had guarded its secret fiercely, but the cub had pried it open. Now, beneath the earth, a voice waited, a man alive, but fading. And the next steps would demand more than belief. They would demand action. Harold Bennett hadn't meant to stray far that evening. He'd followed a deer track downhill, thinking it would curve back toward the trail, but the ground had given way beneath him. One wrong step on soft soil near the hollow mile, and he had dropped into a sinkhole almost 10 feet deep. His left leg crumpled under the fall. He tried to stand, but pain shot through bone and muscle, forcing him down again. That was 3 days ago. Now he sat slumped against the dirt wall, jacket torn, breathing shallow. Each time he shifted, the broken leg screamed. He had sipped rainwater dripping through cracks, rationed the single biscuit he had tucked in his pocket. Hunger gnawed, but thirst was worse. His voice, once strong in a classroom, now rasped thin as paper. He called out at first. He shouted Claire's name until his throat burned. On the second night, he whispered instead, not for rescue, but for memory. Pumpkin, he murmured, his pet name for her since she was 5. He thought of her laughter tumbling down the sledding hill, her eyes lit when he showed her how to tie a sailor's knot at summer camp. "Patience saves you when nothing else can," he'd told her then. Now the words came back as if his younger self were coaching him through the dark. The human mind does strange things in captivity. Time blurs, pain magnifies, memory becomes both torment and salvation. Harold drifted in and out. Sometimes convinced he heard footsteps above, sometimes sure he saw his wife's face in the shifting light. He clung to ritual. Every hour he counted his breaths, tapped his fingers against the dirt, and sets of 5 whispered the alphabet. It wasn't much, but it gave him structure. And in survival, structure matters. When people are trapped, their odds depend as much on psychology as on physical condition. Studies of survival in wilderness accidents show that those who maintain routines, even small ones, reciting prayers, singing songs, keeping count, are more likely to endure. The brain finds strength in rhythm. The lesson is that in chaos, order can become a lifeline. Harold didn't know the science, but instinct told him the same. One night he dreamed he was back in his classroom. He was teaching long division, chalk in hand, when he realized the students were gone. Only Claire sat in the front row, a child again, swinging her legs. She asked, "Are you coming home?" He woke with tears in his eyes, clutching the walking stick he no longer carried, just the memory of it. The hours wore on. Harold's mind fought with itself. One part whispered to give in, let sleep pull him under. The other part clung stubbornly to the thought of Claire, waiting at the farmhouse, her lamp burning late, her voice carrying into the trees. That tug-of-war is common in survival stories. In Alaska, a hiker trapped under a fallen log stayed alive by picturing his daughter's face, repeating her name until help arrived. Perspective. Love can be stronger than despair. When reason falters, connection keeps the heart beating. Harold shifted again, grimacing. He tested the ropes of pain and found he could move a few inches, enough to prop himself higher. He bit his lip, forcing air into his lungs. He reminded himself, breathe, count, hold on. A retired teacher, he'd once drilled lessons into restless students who thought they couldn't master math. He'd tell them, hard problems look impossible until you start one step at a time. He realized now the advice was for him too. Survival was just another hard problem, step by step, breath by breath. We often underestimate older adults, thinking age makes them fragile. But resilience isn't about muscle, it's about mindset. Decades of life had taught Harold patience, persistence, and perspective, tools sharper than any blade. His body might be broken, but his will was still his own. On the third day, Harold's strength waned. His lips cracked, his hands trembled. He pressed his palms against the dirt wall, tried once more to climb, and slipped back down. He lay gasping, vision swimming. For a moment he thought this was the end, but then he heard it faint, almost imagined. A sound above. Scratching, shuffling, then silence. He strained to listen. There it was again. Not boots. Lighter. Quicker. Like claws on wood. At first he thought it was a memory tricking him. But when a clod of dirt tumbled into the hole and landed beside him, his heart jolted. He tilted his head, eyes searching the rim. Nothing visible, just a shadow shifting in the brush. He closed his eyes, whispered, "Claire." No answer. Only the faint huff of an animal. Rescue often arrives disguised. We picture flashing lights, shouts of command, and arms pulling us up. But sometimes it begins with something small. A scratch, a shadow, a presence we don't yet understand. Harold didn't know it then, but the black bear cub was already circling. The same cub Rachel had trusted, the same cub that had led Claire into the hollow mile. He pressed his head back against the dirt and smiled faintly through cracked lips. Whether it was hallucination or hope, it gave him strength. He told himself, hold on longer. Someone or something was near. The truth is, captivity tests not just the body, but the story we tell ourselves. If the story is despair, the end comes quickly. If the story is love, even the weakest frame can endure. Harold chose love. He chose to believe that his daughter was still searching, that the forest had not closed against him, that help was on its way in a form he could not yet name. What Harold couldn't see was the cub pacing above, pawing at the earth, drawing Rachel, Claire, and the deputies closer. The hollow mile had given up one clue already. Now, with every scratch, it was pointing toward a man still alive, waiting in the dark. Rachel Hayes wasn't the sort of person who put herself at the center of things. She preferred to work behind the lens, letting her camera tell the story. But now, walking beside Claire Bennett and Sheriff Carter, she felt something shift. The black bear cub that had once seemed like a curious animal was moving with such focus that ignoring it felt impossible. Each time it paused, sniffing the ground or circling back when they slowed, Rachel couldn't shake the thought this cub had chosen to stay near for a reason. Claire whispered, It's almost like it knows." Her words carried both fear and faith. Sheriff Carter muttered, "Or it's just hungry." Rachel answered quietly, "Maybe, but hunger doesn't explain this. The truth is, scientists have studied black bear behavior for decades. Cubs separated from their mothers often wander in confusion. They look for food, shelter, and comfort, but occasionally their heightened senses smell, sound, even vibration, pick up things humans miss. Bears can detect scents miles away, track faint trails invisible to us. An example comes from Minnesota, where researchers documented a black bear locating a food source under nearly 2 feet of snow, guided only by scent. If a cub could do that, Rachel reasoned, why couldn't one sense a human in distress? Instinct is not random. It's honed by survival, sharpened across generations. Where people rely on tools, animals rely on senses we don't fully understand. Dismissing that would mean dismissing possibilities. As the group pressed deeper, the cub veered suddenly to the left, away from the rough trail the deputies had marked. Carter frowned. "That's not on our map." Rachel stepped forward. "Maybe that's the point. Our maps missed him." Claire nodded fiercely. "Then we follow." It wasn't logic alone moving them now. It was the willingness to trust something outside themselves. Rachel crouched as the cub sniffed a fallen log, pawing at the moss. She brushed the bark aside and found faint drag marks in the soil, as if something or someone had slid. Her throat tightened. "This isn't nothing," she whispered. Carter knelt too, his skepticism cracking. "Looks like movement. We often believe humans are the only rescuers. We build search grids, fly helicopters, and deploy dogs. But sometimes wild animals cross the boundary. There are stories of dolphins circling drowning swimmers, until lifeguards arrived, elephants pulling children from flooded rivers, and even house cats alerting families to fires. It doesn't happen every day. But when it does, it reminds us that survival is not a human-only affair. Nature sometimes steps in." The cub moved again, leading them toward a cluster of brush. Rachel's heart thudded. She thought of her grandfather's words, "Sometimes the woods send you help." She doubted those words for years, dismissing them as old folklore. But now, with Claire gripping her father's walking stick like a lifeline, Rachel saw how belief itself could become part of the rescue. They reached the thicket, and the cub pressed its nose low, whining softly. Claire dropped to her knees, hands trembling as she pulled leaves away. Her fingers touched something rough, a torn sleeve caught in the bramble. She gasped, holding it up. Carter's eyes widened. "That's his jacket." The deputies exchanged glances. Doubt turned to urgency. Rachel steadied her camera, but again she didn't take the shot. She was there not as a witness now, but as a participant. She thought about all the times she had stayed hidden, watching life unfold through a lens. Now she was in the middle of it because of a cub that refused to walk away. Sometimes we have to step out from behind observation and into participation. Watching is safe, but saving requires risk. Rachel hadn't planned on becoming part of a rescue, but by trusting the cub, she crossed that line. The deputies radioed back to the command post. Carter ordered ropes and medical gear to be brought forward. Volunteers stirred some still skeptical others, whispering about miracles. Claire didn't wait. She pressed her palm to the fabric tears in her eyes. "Dad, we're close. Hold on." The cub gave one last paw at the ground and sat back. Its role seemed complete, but Rachel felt its presence linger like a thread binding them all. She thought of the way communities often look only to human strength. Yet here a young wild animal had shifted the course. The fresh perspective is this humility matters. When we accept that guidance can come from unexpected places, we open the door to solutions we never imagined. By dusk, ropes arrived. Carter gathered the team. He looked at Rachel. "You were right to follow it." She shook her head. "I just listened," Claire added softly. And so did it. The cub shuffled toward the tree line, pausing once as if to glance back, then disappeared into the shadows. Rachel watched it go, whispering, "Thank you." The clearing was silent except for the volunteers preparing gear, but the silence wasn't hopeless anymore. It carried expectation. Something was below them, someone alive waiting. The black bear cub had led them to the edge of discovery. The deputies lowered their flashlights into the sinkhole beams cutting through the dark, and there, faint but certain, came the sound of breath. Harold Bennett was still alive. The fight to bring him home had begun. The deputies knelt at the sinkhole's edge, flashlights aimed downward. At first, the light bounced off dirt walls and nothing more. Then, faintly there, it was a shape slumped against the earth's shoulders, rising with shallow breaths. Claire's cry broke the silence. "Dad." The sound echoed, trembling but real. From below came a hoarse answer. Weak, cracked, but unmistakable. "Pumpkin." The ground itself seemed to exhale. The team erupted into motion. Sheriff Carter barked orders. Ropes uncoiled harnesses, checked anchors, hammered into the soil. Volunteers who had doubted hours earlier now moved with urgency. The black bear cub had gone into the shadows, but its role lingered in every action. Rachel Hayes steadied Claire, though her own hands shook. She whispered, "He's alive. That's what matters now." Discovery is only the first step. Extraction is often the hardest. Terrain, weather, and injury all conspire against speed. In wilderness, search and rescue training, the rule is simple. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Rushing risks collapse. That's why Carter, though, his heart pounded, forced calm into his voice. "We do this steadily. One chance to get it right." An example comes from a case in Oregon years ago when a hiker trapped in a ravine was nearly lost because rescuers rushed. The descent slipped and caused a rock slide that buried him further. The lesson is sobering urgency must always bend to discipline. Deputy Morales volunteered first. Harness clipped, helmet strapped, he eased over the rim boots, pressing into loose dirt. Each step sent pebbles tumbling. Claire clutched the walking stick, whispering prayers under her breath. Rachel lifted her camera, but lowered it again. This wasn't a moment to capture, it was a moment to hold. Below, Harold stirred. His head tilted toward the rope squeaking above. "I'm here," he rasped. Morales called down, "We see you, sir. We're coming." The words, simple as they were, carried life back into Harold's chest. He pressed a trembling hand to the wall, grounding himself in the sound. Rescues like this demand not just skill, but trust between strangers. Morales spoke steadily as he descended. "Almost there. Keep breathing." Every phrase mattered. Survival experts say reassurance can stabilize a victim's pulse better than medicine in those first fragile minutes. Words become lifelines. When Morales reached the bottom, he crouched beside Harold, checked his vitals quickly. Broken leg dehydration, hypothermia, setting in. He radioed up. "He's weak but responsive. We'll need a basket haul." Carter's reply was firm. "Prepare him. We'll lower it slowly." The litter basket creaked as it descended, ropes taut under the weight. Morales guided it close, speaking to Harold the whole time. "We're lifting you out. Your daughter is waiting. Stay with me." Harold's cracked lips formed a smile. Claire Morales squeezed his shoulder. "She's right above us." Claire leaned over, voice trembling but strong. "Dad, we're here. We're not leaving." That promise, echoing the one Harold had once made to her, steadied him. He let them strap his body into the basket, grimacing as his legs shifted but holding on. In moments of rescue, pain is inevitable, but the presence of loved ones can eclipse it. Countless survival stories cite the same refrain: "I held on because someone was waiting." For Harold, that someone was Claire. The haul began. Ropes strained, pulleys creaked, volunteers heaved in rhythm. Carter counted aloud, pull, hold, keeping tempo like a drum beat. Every inch upward felt like a mile. Dirt showered down the basket, swayed, and Morales braced against the wall to steady it. Above, Rachel held her breath, heart pounding with every squeak of rope. Halfway up, the basket snagged on a root. The ropes jerked, groans rose. Carter snapped. Hold silence gripped the clearing. Claire's knuckles whitened around the stick. Rachel saw tears brimming but refused to let fear win. "They'll free it," she whispered. "They have to." Morales called up calmly. "Give me slack." The rope eased. He shifted the basket, kicking at the root until it snapped free. "Clear. Keep pulling." Relief swept the rim like a wave. Carter resumed the count. Inch by inch, the basket rose. Finally, hands reached over the edge, gripping the frame, hauling it onto solid ground. Harold lay, pale lips blue, but his eyes opened as Claire fell to her knees beside him. "Dad," he managed to whisper. "Pumpkin." She pressed her forehead to his tears, soaking into his flannel. Rachel turned away, not out of detachment, but out of reverence. Some reunions were too sacred to watch. She noticed the volunteers' tough men skeptical earlier, quiet, now eyes lowered. Even Carter, steady as stone, cleared his throat before giving orders. "Wrap him in blankets. Get fluids ready. Ambulance is staged at the trailhead. Rescues are not only about saving a life, but about reshaping a community." Doubt had weighed on them. Fatigue had frayed them, but one man lifted from the ground by steady hands and unexpected guidance reminded them why they had come. It wasn't duty alone. It belonged. Harold's hand, weak but deliberate, reached for Claire's. "I tried to get home," he murmured. She squeezed tight. "You did. And we found you." Her voice carried not triumph but gratitude to her father, to the deputies, to Rachel, even to the cub that had vanished into the trees. They loaded Harold onto a stretcher, moving carefully across the rough terrain. Every step was coordinated, deputies calling commands, volunteers clearing the path. Rachel walked behind, noting how the forest seemed less hostile now. The hollow mile hadn't swallowed Harold, it had hidden him until the right guide appeared. Sometimes rescue demands more than strength or skill. It demands humility to accept help from the unexpected, whether that's a stranger with a camera or a black bear cub with instincts no human could match. As the stretcher reached the edge of the clearing, Claire turned once more toward the shadows. "Thank you," she whispered into the trees. No one else knew to whom she spoke, but Rachel did. And maybe, just maybe, the cub heard. But the story wasn't finished. For while Harold was safe in human hands now, the image of that small bear lingering at the rim would not fade. In the hours to come, its silent watch would give the rescue a meaning none of them could have imagined. The stretcher team moved slowly through sterling forest boots, crunching over loose timber voices, low but steady. Claire walked beside her father, gripping his hand whenever the path jolted. Rachel Hayes followed closely, her camera bouncing unused at her hip. The black bear cub was gone, at least for now, but none of them could shake the sense that it was still nearby. Halfway to the trailhead, Carter called a halt. The stretcher needed repositioning, ropes retied. The woods had grown darker, and the searchlights cast shifting beams through the trees. That's when Rachel noticed movement near the ridge. Two amber glints reflected the light. Not men, not flashlights, eyes. The cub. It didn't approach. It simply sat at the edge of the clearing, silent and unmoving, and head tilted as if watching. Claire gasped softly. It stayed. Carter frowned uneasy, but Rachel felt her chest warm. "It's not threatening us," she whispered. "It's guarding." Here's an explanation worth pausing on. In wildlife, behavior guarding isn't something cubs usually do. They're vulnerable, instinctively cautious. But animals don't always act according to the book. History records cases where wild animals lingered near human rescues. In Canada, a wolf pack once shadowed rangers, extracting an injured moose, circling but never attacking, as though recognizing the urgency of the moment. The line between instinct and intention is thin. Claire squeezed her father's hand, whispering, "He's still here, Dad." Harold's lips parted, faint but certain. "Angel." His voice cracked, but his meaning was clear. For a man drifting in and out of pain, the sight of the cub was more than chance, it was providence. Meaning isn't always about proof, it's about perspective. To skeptics, the cub was just curious. To Claire and Harold, it was a guardian. And that belief gave them strength. In survival psychology, perception shapes endurance. Believing you are watched over, even by something wordless and wild, can steady the will to live. The deputies murmured uneasily, but no one moved to chase the cub away. Carter simply muttered, "As long as it stays there." The stretcher team lifted again, moving forward. Each time they stopped to rest, the cub shifted too, keeping its distance but never leaving. Rachel felt a quiet awe. She had come to the forest to capture images of nature. She hadn't expected nature to capture her instead. We often think of wild animals as symbols: bear for strength, wolf for danger, eagle for freedom. But what if those symbols are not ours to give? What if in rare moments the animals choose their own role in our stories? This cub, separated from its mother, could have disappeared into the hills. Instead, it stayed, threading its life into Harold's rescue. Perhaps not by plan, but by presence. And presence is sometimes enough. The team pressed on. Claire's energy flagged, but whenever she faltered, her eyes flicked toward the ridge. Seeing the cub still watching gave her the strength to walk on. That's the subtle power of companionship, even when unspoken. Psychologists call it social facilitation, the way performance improves when we believe someone is observing. Athletes run faster in front of a crowd, and patients heal quickly with family nearby. Why not apply the same to a frightened daughter guiding her injured father through the woods while a bear cub lingered in the shadows? There's an example that echoes here. In Alaska, a kayaker stranded on a sandbar swore that the sight of a single bald eagle circling above kept him calm until help arrived. He admitted the eagle likely had no interest in him, but believing it was there for him gave him courage. The lesson isn't about the eagle's intent, it's about the kayaker's resilience. Belief matters. By the time the rescue team reached the trailhead, headlights from the ambulance lit the clearing. Harold was transferred carefully, paramedics checking vitals, wrapping him in heated blankets. Claire kissed his forehead, tears running freely now. "You're safe," Harold whispered. "Home." 2 syllables, but they carried the weight of survival. Rachel turned to look back at the ridge. The cub was still there. The crowd of volunteers had grown noisy, radios, crackling doors, slamming, but through it all, the animal stayed motionless. Only when the ambulance doors closed and the engine started did the cub finally turn, slipping quietly into the trees. Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to call out to say thank you, but the words stayed in her chest. Sometimes the most powerful help arrives without acknowledgement. The cub never received a medal, never even touched the man it had guided them toward, yet its silent watch shaped the rescue as much as any rope or stretcher. That is the mystery of connection. It doesn't need recognition to matter. Carter adjusted his coat, glancing at Rachel. "Well," he muttered, "I can't explain it, but I won't forget it." Rachel nodded. Some things aren't meant to be explained. The volunteers dispersed, their fatigue replaced by something lighter. They carried home not just the relief of success, but a story that would ripple through the town for years. Children would draw pictures of a little bear and an old man reunited with his daughter. Neighbors would tell the tale of how a cub refused to walk away. Stories bind communities, and this one had already taken root. Rescue is not just about saving a life. It's about weaving meaning into the fabric of a place. Sterling Forest would no longer be known only for its dangers and abandoned logging camps. It would be remembered as the place where a black bear cub kept watch over a man until his people could reach him. Rachel finally lifted her camera. Not to photograph the cub, it was gone, but to capture the empty ridge bathed in fading light, a frame of absence holding presence. She whispered to herself, "Sometimes the forest sends you help." For the first time, she knew those words were true. Hours later, in the clean brightness of a hospital room, Harold Bennett would lie safe at last. But the story would not end with his survival. It would deepen into legacy, a bond between man, daughter, and bear that the whole town would carry forward. The night after Harold's rescue, Sterling Forest lay quiet under a sky full of stars. In the hospital, Harold rested beneath a warm blanket, his breathing steady. Claire sat in a chair by his side, hand clasped around his, whispering, You kept your promise. You made it home." His eyes flickered open, weary but alive, and his cracked smile carried the weight of a vow fulfilled. Rachel Hayes stood in the hallway leaning against the wall with her camera still hanging unused. She'd captured no shots of the rescue itself, only fragments of the aftermath. Claire's tears, the volunteers hugging one another, the sheriff wiping his brow. But the image that stayed most vivid in her mind wasn't on her memory card at all. It was of a black bear cub, sitting quietly at the edge of the clearing, watching. The community rallied quickly. Neighbors brought casseroles and bread to Claire's house, leaving notes of love on the porch. Children taped drawings on the sheriff's office windows. Harold, with his walking stick, Claire by his side, and a small bear drawn with oversized eyes and round ears. In the diner downtown, people leaned over coffee cups, telling and retelling how a cub had done what dozens of trained searchers couldn't. Here's a clear explanation of why this matters. Stories are not just entertainment, they shape the way communities understand themselves. Psychologists call it narrative identity, the idea that we define who we are through the stories we tell and repeat. Sterling Forest, once known only for its dangers and abandoned camps, now had a new story, the black bear cub that guided rescuers to a missing man. That story would carry meaning far beyond the forest itself. An example comes from Alaska, where locals still speak of a sled dog that once led villagers to stranded travelers during a snowstorm. Decades later, the dog's memory is honored in festivals and statues, not because it changed the world, but because it changed their world. The same was happening here in Vermont. Legacy is not always about great deeds or monumental changes. Sometimes it's about presence, the simple, stubborn act of showing up when it matters. Harold showed up by surviving. Claire showed up by refusing to stop searching. Rachel showed up by trusting her instincts. And the cub showed up by not walking away. Together, their presence wove a legacy. Weeks later, once Harold had healed enough to stand with crutches, the town gathered at the library lawn. Sheriff Carter stood at a small podium, voice steady but softer than usual. "We search with maps, with radios, with ropes. But this time we were taught that rescue is also about humility. We were reminded that sometimes help comes from beyond our plans." He lifted a plaque, engraved with words simple and bold, "Guardian of Sterling Forest." It was placed not in honor of any deputy, not even Harold, but in honor of the cub. The crowd applauded, some laughing through tears. Rachel clicked her shutter this time. She wanted the moment recorded a community, choosing to honor not just human effort, but the wild itself. That choice held knowledge too often forgotten that humans and wild animals are not separate stories, but overlapping ones. Claire later walked the trail back into the hollow mile, this time carrying a small basket of apples and leaving them near the ridge. Not as bait, not to tame, but as thanks. She whispered, "We won't forget you." The act was quiet, unseen by most, but it carried weight. Gratitude has a way of echoing longer than applause. Perhaps the real guardian of Sterling Forest was not just the cub, but the bond that formed between people and nature in those days. When we treat wild animals as threats or spectacles, we miss the possibility that they can also be companions in mystery. Not pets, not property, but fellow travelers. Knowledge tells us that black bear cubs grow quickly, that this one would soon wander off seeking territory, perhaps never seen again by human eyes. Yet the story of what it did would outlive its paw prints. And that is how legacies work. They continue long after the actors move on. In the hospital days after his rescue, Harold told a nurse, "I thought I was alone." But I wasn't. That sentence holds a lesson for all of us. Feeling alone is one of the deepest fears humans carry. Yet survival stories prove again and again that connection, whether through people, animals, or faith, keeps us alive. We endure not just by strength, but by belonging. So what does this mean for us? Maybe it means paying attention to small signs, to instincts we often dismiss. Maybe it means trusting that help can come from unexpected places. Maybe it means remembering that legacy isn't about fame, but about the moments when presence turned despair into hope. And maybe, just maybe, it means rethinking how we see the wild, black bears, grizzly bears, polar bears, wolves, all the wild animals that fill our forests and tundras. They are not just backdrops for human stories. They have stories too, and sometimes, if we are willing to listen, those stories intersect with ours in ways that change everything. The town of Stowe would never look at Sterling Forest the same way again, and neither should we. Because if a black bear cub can lead rescuers to a missing man, then perhaps the world is more connected, more mysterious, and more generous than we often allow ourselves to believe. Now I'd like to turn the question to you. Have you ever felt guided, even protected in a way you couldn't explain? Have you ever been reminded that you are not as alone as you thought? Take a moment to reflect on that. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of resilience, love, or the unexpected bonds between humans and animals, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe for more, and join us in honoring the wild stories that remind us who we are.